Hello and welcome to the first episode of the Pebble Inspector. My name's James Gray. I am your host and writer, producer, editor. In fact, I am the Pebble Inspector in chief of this podcast. This first episode is just an introduction to me and the podcast and what it's going to be about. I'll also do a few readings of my work just to perhaps introduce you to the kind of writing I've been doing, and then I'll hopefully lay out where we're going with the podcast in future episodes. So hopefully quite a short one, and certainly allows me to iron out a few of the wrinkles in the editing process and see how all this works. So who am I? My name's James Gray, I think I mentioned. I am a student at Lancaster University. I'm studying for a master's in creative writing and literature studies, and I'm just in the process of writing my final dissertation for that. It's a one-year course, and we're coming near the end of it now. So I gave up my full-time job to do this, to pursue writing, and I figured I should probably get some qualification or some direction in it, which is where the masters came in. I previously worked for about a decade, mainly in marketing and sales, which was a semi-creative process, but obviously within very strict boundaries of briefs and KPIs and all sorts of ugly stuff. So I wasn't 100% happy doing that. I knew I wanted to write, but that kind of work didn't leave me with much creative juice at the end of the day. I didn't fancy opening the laptop. So yeah, I jacked it in, and I think I'm really happy with that decision. So yeah, that was my background. And then prior to that, I worked in sales. And then a long time ago, my original undergrad degree was in geological oceanography. So wet rock and sand and long dead little things, Nemo's long lost great granddads. And I never used it. I never went anywhere with that degree. I always intended on going back and doing a master's in it, and never did. But I think everything that you learn in life goes on to inform what you do, and it includes your writing. And so the geology and the natural world in the granular detail is still something that I think comes into my writing, very obviously in some stuff. I think some of the readings I'm going to do, but just in general, I like the language and terminology and imagery of geology and rocks and the earth and the ground and nature plays a big part in what I write. So whilst I didn't do anything with the degree, it wasn't a complete waste of time. I get to write little stories now with rocks in. So I'm much older, I'm not much wiser. I'm staring down the barrel of 40, and I have no job. I have a mortgage. I have a very small child to provide for, and I decided to give up my job and do this instead. And you're coming along for the ride with me. So what is the Pebble Inspector? The Pebble Inspector is a podcast which is a journal of my writing and creative process. The idea being I record a digest or a review of that week's writing or not writing. What I've written, how I feel about it, what I haven't written, what I wish I'd written, where I think it's going, and also what I've been reading that has helped me or informed me or just that I've enjoyed or thought useful. It's primarily acting as a journal for my own purposes. Part of the degree program has been the reflective practice of critical reflective essays, critical reflection, which is something I've never practiced because I never came from the background of the undergrad pathway of doing creative writing or literature studies. So it's something that I'm unpracticed at, and it is my weak point. So this is a step towards improving that, but also I hope that perhaps other people might find it helpful or interesting to have an insight into the writing process, whether they're writing themselves or just interested in the process of writing. So that is the Pebble Inspector. I'll read some examples of my work just so you can get an idea of the kind of stuff I'm writing. I generally work in short fiction, essay, lyric essay, life writing, a little bit of what looks a bit like poetry. I've written a little play, work in a few different things. Tends to be focused on imagery and lyric, less so on lots of car chases and bombs going off and plot twists and turns. I like to just kind of pick things up and have a look at them and turn them over and look for the creases and the absurdities of life, and then sort of put them back down again and just think, well, that's a bit weird, wasn't it? So there's little bits of uncanny in there. I'm going to do a separate episode of books that I've been reading recently, and perhaps that might be a bit of an insight into some of those inspirations and what's informing my writing as well. So I meant to start this podcast a good while ago. I always thought if I ever did start writing, I would record my process along the way, and the critical reflection element of the degree has actually sort of spurred me on to do that. But it turns out doing a full-time master's and looking after a small child and trying to renovate the house and trying to maintain the sort of bare bones of a life, it's quite time consuming. And so sitting down, talking into a microphone, editing it, figuring out how to get it onto the internet and all the rest of it is actually quite time consuming. So I haven't started it until now. So what I will do is each week I'll talk about the piece that I've been writing, but because I've kind of got a backlog, I guess, of pieces, I'm going to pre-record some episodes, including this one, where I will look back at pieces that I've written, talk about the process and where I'm up to with them. So it's a little bit of a cheat, but it does give me a few episodes in hand that I can then start posting, and means that I'm holding myself to this weekly episode idea, but at least I've got a little slack in the system by doing that. So I'll do a few readings, and then I'll talk about some of the pieces I'm going to cover in the next episodes. So let me do some readings, and I'll speak a little bit about each piece and where it's come from, which might be useful. So start off with, I won't read the whole thing because it's quite long. This is my submission actually for my short story module that I did last term. I came into this degree thinking short stories, that's what I'm going to be doing. That's what I read most of. It's what I love. I just love the form. I've read so many short stories that are just so good that make me want to do it. When you read something, you think it's just so how do they do it? And I just want to know that, and I want to get inside that, and I love the brevity, and I love the way it forces this kind of obviously the example being like Hemingway's pared back prose, where it's like literally just a few lines. That's the one that everyone seems to get taught. And absolutely, like, his short stories are amazing, and it's a really good example of the craft, but how you can build a world and place somebody in it, and you just bring them in and you show them it, and then you zoom back out and you're like, there you go, just walk away with it. And I find that a short story stays with me longer than a novel quite often, because there's so many, or quite often, unanswered questions, or questions asked of yourself, or just like these images that are created, because you have such short amount of time to get the reader, that obviously the imagery that is used and the situations and the stories are just so stark, and they linger with you. And yeah, I just love the form. So coming into this degree, I was expecting that is going to be what I do, and it was really interesting. So for the first term, we did a module called Personal Essay, which I'd never really considered. Didn't feel like I knew much about it, and it turned out I'd actually been reading this kind of stuff for a very long time and really enjoying it. I just never put a name to it, and I really enjoyed that module. So that opened my eyes to this whole other way of doing things. And the other module that I did, which was like creative criticism, and that opened my eyes to a whole other way of thinking about writing and books and responding to other people's work. So then I came to the short story module in the second term, and I was really excited about it, and I blocked up. I just felt like it was almost a kind of, I guess, like performance anxiety, because this was the big one. This is the thing that I should be like absolutely loving, and I did actually really struggle with it. I don't know. I couldn't find my voice. I couldn't find the structure. I was coming up with imagery, but it wasn't really going anywhere, and it wasn't progressing. And then a lot of my writing tended to be very distant and very anonymous. And my stories were like that, which I thought was good. I'd read a lot of, these kind of 20th century male American, often, authors, and that was their style, kind of Hemingway-esque. And it was there was no real hook there. There was no personal or emotive hook, and I was struggling with that. So yeah, it was a surprising challenge. So this is the piece that I wrote as my final submission, and I was pleased with it. I brought in some of the kind of creative critical elements by referencing previous work and having kind of references and allusions to other writers and other work. I felt like it had a good element of the personal, but yet I still avoided. There's only one character, and he doesn't do an awful lot. I'll read some of the story and then talk a little bit more about it. So the story's called Blackthorn, and it opens with a quote from a play which is a prequel to King Lear, Shakespeare's King Lear. It's a prequel to that, written in the early 20th century by a poet called Gordon Bottomley, who, I'll talk a little bit about this afterwards, but he actually lived not too far from me, or where I live now. So this is the quote, King Lear. A letter, what read you in a letter? That's from King Lear's Wife, 1913, is the name of the play. And then it has a definition. Pleach, verb, to bend and bind branches of a hedge or tree. Dear Cordelia, no, that's too formal. Dearest Cordelia, that's worse. My daughter, my little jumbly girl, I don't know how to start, where to start. My love, this is not the first time I have tried to write to you. Edward Lear grunts as he kneels beneath the dark briars that pluck at his jacket. The earth rises to bite into his knees. He had tried a small fold of foam, an off-cut of camping mat, but it was just another thing to move along as he worked. Better to entrust his knees to the ground and hope that not too many sharp stones left their mark, a mark of time and body, low over the ground. He works with a small hand scythe, quick sharp movements to catch last year's growth, bramble and nettle, yellow stalks, others rotted to black. Long wreaths of cleavers bind to his blade and hand as he drags them free. He clears his sleeves one at a time of their clinging stalks, adding them to the pile for burning. He rakes the ground to bare soil. A robin follows, a wingbeat behind. Close beside a leafy thicket, on his nose there was a cricket. In his hat, a railway ticket, but his shoes were far too tight. Edward Lear. Your mother's first words to me were a poem, or at least that's how I choose to remember them. She told me those lines were Lear's last before he died. She asked if I thought it was sad. Edward, never Ted, even to the few that know him well enough to use it, moves a little further along. He works steadily. He leaves a chain of small piles behind him. There is little green amongst them, a hatch of brown and grey, used up and made low by frost and winter rain, the weight of themselves. When he reaches the field corner, he will gather them together. They will burn fast, helped by the jerry can of petrol on his passenger seat. A fast, hot flame. Thick grey smoke, swollen and hissing with boiled rain. He uncovers a rabbit, dead at its warren. Fur matted with rain and whatever its body had produced as it rots. The eyes silvery and streaked dark, skin turned from its mouth. Long yellow teeth show against black lips, too diseased even for carrion. She introduced herself, a poet. I'd never met a poet, despite my namesake. I wasn't sure what to say, as if I had to reply with a poem of my own. I hated my name. My parents, your grandparents, always found it funny. Maybe they thought I'd live up to it. Every teacher I'd ever had loved to quote lines at me, stupid little nonsense rhymes, like I could never be anything but a silly joke to them. Your mother was the first person I ever forgave for quoting them to me. She found it highly amusing and I forgave her immediately. Edward sits on his heels, straightening his back. He looks down at the scythe in his hand, the ash handle dark where it fits his right palm. The inner edge catches the flat grey morning. The curved back shows a patina of dark steel, etched with scrawled oxide. His hands are stained green. Soil highlights the crease of his finger joints. His lifelines are white against the dirt. Turning his free hand over, he extends his fingers out. The knuckles are thick, stiffened already after only a few hours. He flexes his hand and watches white scars smile back. His thumb runs over a callus on the pad of his forefinger. As a younger man, his hands emerge from the hedge scratched and bloodied each time. Blisters opening to bright, stinging pink in the web of his thumb, with half a working day still ahead. Evening spent picking at splinters, thorns beneath the skin. So I'll leave that there. So that's Blackthorn. You can read the full transcript actually on my website, should you wish to. I have a little section there called Work, where I've uploaded some pieces that you can read in full. So that started out from watching hedge layers near my house, and it just seemed like a really methodical, interesting skill. That there was a lot of things in there. The idea of you partially cut through the stalks and bend them and stake them in place so that the hedge keeps growing but horizontally. And the idea of cutting something just enough that you can bend it without killing it seemed really interesting. I refer to it later in the story as a necessary violence. And it felt like there's a lot of imagery there that would be a very nice backdrop for a story. And I also like the way that you progress along a hedge to do it. So I had that image in my mind, but I needed something to happen or some emotional hook. And the idea of an internal monologue or an internal life of this hedge layer working alone in a field really appealed. And so I started thinking about, and again with a short story, they tend to be quite dramatic, some of them. So it needed to be an emotional hook. So I was thinking of emotional stuff and what could have happened to this guy. And so I thought of a widowed father, and the idea of him having a child and having lost the mother. And then the idea of estrangement from that daughter, who he's then writing these letters to, which allows me to give him a voice and a dialogue, even though it's a one-sided dialogue, but an inner monologue of him speaking to his daughter, who he's become estranged from. And I found that part actually came quite easily. I don't know, writing those letters, I guess I was, channeling some inner, I have a daughter, although she's a lot younger than the daughter in this story. Just putting yourself in that position, I guess, and the idea of losing your partner and how that would feel, and then losing your daughter in a secondary way. So that built from there, and then to alternate these really tender, difficult, broken sentences that he's trying to construct and write in his head with this very physical, violent, yet regenerative act of hedge laying felt like quite a natural combination. And then I was thinking of a name for him, and I was kind of thinking of famous literary I wanted to bring in kind of literary reference, I guess, or just references. As I was trying to think of famously widowed fathers of daughters in literature, which is where King Lear comes in. He's a king with several daughters, and he's deciding who to give his fortune to, and it drives him mad from memory. So I thought Lear would be a good surname for him, and I was trying to think of a first name, and I thought, well, Edward Lear sounds quite good. And for a few seconds I thought, yeah, it sounds familiar though. I couldn't think. Anyway, so it's obviously the guy who wrote The Owl and the Pussycat and various nonsense rhymes. I thought, oh shit, I can't use that. But actually maybe that works quite well, and it becomes part of his personality. And I liked the idea that was his name. He resented it, but it was part of his personality, and then he would read those poems to his infant daughter, which felt quite nice. So he quotes them a little bit in the letters, and I used some of the terms like jumbly girl and stuff. So that felt quite nice. Then I was casting around for names of the other people. So the mother and there's an aunt, and I looked to King Lear, the play, but I didn't realise that King Lear's wife is never named in the play. She's just his dead wife, the Queen. So again, a bit of Googling around, and I found this play called King Lear's Wife, which was written by Gordon Bottomley in 1913. And it's a prequel to King Lear, and it gives Queen Lear, his wife, a voice and volition and autonomy and tragedy. And it was really interesting. And then he names her, although the name is Hugid, I think, which is kind of an old English name. And I thought, I can't have her called Hugid. It's not particular. I mean, I've already got Edward Lear, which is unrealistic, so I can't have Hugid. So I think that gets changed to Hilda. And then his daughter is Cordelia, and the maid is Merrin, and so that became the aunt. But what was interesting, I was reading more about Gordon Bottomley. He was a poet originally from Keighley, that is actually listed as my town of birth. So that felt like a nice connection. His poetry was very much based on the land. It was quite bleak, quite dark, quite pastoral, but in a kind of dark pastoral way, which really appealed to me, and also really spoke to the hedge layer element of the story. So that felt very appropriate. But then reading more about Gordon, he had tuberculosis. They moved in from Keighley, which is like Milltown, initially to Cartmel, which is just over the bay from where I live, and somewhere I've spent a lot of time as a kid. And then he moved to a village called Silverdale, which is even closer. It's literally just over the hill from me. And that was perfect. That meant that gave my hedge layer a location. I knew that he was operating in the kind of Silverdale-ish area, or a fictional version of it, this landscape of woodland and limestone, and I knew that's where it was. So really instructive and really nice bit of kind of synchronicity to have found that out. So I really enjoyed that element of it. And the actual final piece doesn't have any of... Originally I had quotes from Gordon Bottomley's poetry as well, and I eventually removed them all apart from that first line on the subheader. So it's a shame in a way, but I guess it's just like a private part of the development of the story. But I would have loved to have put more into it, but it would have been shoehorned and it wouldn't have worked. So I did have to remove it. So that's Blackthorn, which is a piece that I really enjoyed writing. I don't think it's perfect at all. I think it still needs a resolution at the end. I felt like it was a very ambiguous end, but which I like in stories, but I probably needed just a little bit more of just a breadcrumb for the reader. Not perfect by any standard, but I did enjoy that. Chatting to a friend of mine he's a videographer, a filmmaker. I used to work with him on projects in my kind of previous career, and we've chatted about perhaps adapting it for a short film, which would be really exciting. So I'm not saying it's going to happen, but it would be very cool if it did. So I read something completely different now, which I wrote a version of this a long time ago, just when I was out walking the dog, and there was a version of it. I sent it to a friend who asked me to record myself reciting it. He then used that as a sample for a track, kind of ambient fuzzy thing that he made, which I think still is on Spotify. But I then used this, or again a version of this again, in one of my submissions for personal essay. The piece, I submitted 2 pieces, but this particular piece was an account of being a kid and studying geology for my GCSEs. And it was an extra lesson that we could do after school, and this guy, who was the history and geography teacher, would do it off his own back, teaches this. So it was kind of like an ode to him. But it was a particular episode where my dad gave me a lift to a talk in the back room of a pub that a local science society put on. They would have visiting speakers, and this one was a geologist, so we went to this geology talk. And there was this moment where my dad on the drive home kind of admitted that he just couldn't get his head around the concept of rock moving like a liquid in the mantle of the earth. So you have convection currents, and kind of like magma, but it's deeper in the earth. And how is that possible? And also how can it move? How can it flow when it's under pressure? And it was this really strange moment where, as a child, I was like 15, I knew more than my dad. It felt like an inversion. So it was an account of that told in a fairly traditional form. But then each section, so each page essentially, had a poem in response to what was happening in that account. So I think there was 4 poems in total, and I'm going to read 2 of them from that. This first one is like the opening poem, which sets the tone, I guess, and then the other one is from the end of the section where there's this kind of revelation of my dad not understanding something that I had some understanding of. So this is the first piece, which acts as an introduction to maybe the themes of the piece. It's called Forecast into Stone. Limestone now, rhyolite later, good. Metamorphic, giving way to igneous intrusions in the west-northwest, uncertain. Porphyritic now, sand later. Chance of isolated pockets of slate, fair. Carboniferous, Silurian, Quaternary, turning. Ordovician, Cambrian. Subducting in the east, giving way to mantle by dawn. Outlook for all areas west of Old Red Sandstone. Fair, turning quartzite, later. Crust, clastic sill, intrusive, fair to good. All areas experiencing superposition by dawn, schist later. Granite, gabbro, garnet, good. So that's obviously in the style of the shipping forecast, but it's geological terminology and rock types and eras and stuff. And it was originally inspired. I was walking the dog, looking out from the bit of like hill that I was on, the kind of fields. And there was limestone, dry stone walls in front of me, and I was on limestone area of landscape. And then I was looking across towards the Lake District, which the hills there are made of rhyolite, which is a different rock type. It's like a volcanic rock type. And I had this idea of limestone now, rhyolite later. That's the first line. And as I said, I thought of that, and it sounds like shipping forecast, and then, yeah, the rest came from that. So, yeah, this is the second piece. This comes at the end where we have this sort of revelation. Well, it's not really a revelation, but this moment of realization. And the poems were kind of, not so much that first one, but the other poems were kind of written from the other person who I'm talking about's perspective. So one of the sections I'm talking about, the teacher, it was called Mr. Waterhouse. He's probably dead now, so I can name him. Who taught us, and he was this really gruff guy who, no nonsense Yorkshireman, but he clearly was devoted to teaching and to the subject because he gave up his evenings to teach us. And so it's kind of a poem from his perspective. And then there was another section talking about superposition and folding and the order of things and non-conformities and stuff. These are all geological terms. But there's a guy who basically, a geologist, who first described folding within rocks where they get pushed over each other, and it's called nap folding, and nap as in napkin or tablecloth, and so it's from his perspective. And then this one, which is kind of from my dad's perspective, responding to what was happening in that moment that I was describing in the piece. And it's called Unmoored. A chrysalis contains the liquid remains of what went before and all to come. That much I can understand, hold between finger and thumb. But think of us awash and at sea on rafts not of our own design, on an ocean hotter than stars. Our sun, the guide, the surface, a new and unfamiliar territory, a horizon tilted on axis, a new orbit for both bodies. So it's quite a visual poem. It's kind of a hard one to recite, but I'm working with this idea of overturning and familiar, surface, shore, whatever. I don't know. Maybe it works, maybe it doesn't. But this was like my first excuse to really give poetry a go, I guess, and that's what I've really liked about this degree, is just the cringe element is kind of removed because everyone's doing the same thing. I had a lot of imposter syndrome, and I still do. And, I felt like a caveman who's like been discovered that he knows his alphabet. And I feel so untutored and uncouth in my grasp of how to do things. And there's all these students that are like half my age, almost, who, they know so much, and they've got all the right words for what they're talking about, and they know they can reference so many things. And I just felt like a bit of an imposter. But then I also noticed they're all kind of referencing the same stuff. They all reference Frankenstein and Jane Eyre, whereas I haven't read those, but I've read a shit ton of other stuff. I don't know, it's a funny thing. It's all different. But yeah, removing the cringe. So this is the last thing I'm going to read. So this, I wrote this a while ago, but I resurrected it for the short story module. It was never completed. It was an exercise in editing. We had to write something, and then somebody else would edit it for us. So this is the original version that I wrote, that I submitted for that. It's completely different. It's not my style. I don't really write in genre, so sci-fi or horror or whatever. Not because I don't like those genres. It's just not in my wheelhouse. I used to read quite a bit of fantasy when I was a kid. I think like a lot of people. I'm not going to say I grew out of it because that's like dismissive. I just haven't been back to it, and I just prefer some of the other forms these days. But I keep thinking, I should pop back. I read Dune a couple of years ago, and I really enjoyed it. And I thought, you know what, actually, it's quite a nice bit of kind of world building escapism that's kind of cool. Still really love like Terry Pratchett and stuff. So, and I guess I was trying to write this maybe in the style of Terry Pratchett, I guess, of that quite sort of, I don't know, you'll see whether you agree or not. I don't know. It's called The Camel. The camel is a wise animal. It takes life at a pace that is painstakingly well suited to its environment. Over millennia of evolution, the camel has been shaped by its environment to become the most camel-like thing that there can be. It can find water across hundreds of miles of dry desert. It can go without water for weeks at a time. It can, in fact, go without water for as long as it takes to find the next oasis. And it can relentlessly seek out the water at the most efficient pace possible. You will never see a camel sweat. It will plod without complaint for as long as it takes to find that next drink. The camel does not sweat, and the camel does not complain. The camel is a wise animal. This particular camel stood looking toward the horizon with the kind of infuriating patience that only intense heat and silence can bring. The horizon shimmered at such a distance and over such featureless land that it bowed across the field of vision as if the very curve of the earth was revealed in the expanse. The camel's sparse whiskers twitched as it sampled the air through its wide, flat nose. Its highly developed sense of smell and taste created a map of sand and water in its otherwise uncluttered mind. A bearing was taken, and its large brown eyes turned slightly in the direction of the next as yet invisible oasis. A languid blink of long, thick lashes heralded a slight change of direction in the rest of the body as the camel began to think about moving towards the next sip. It was at this point that this particular camel was hit by a train. The intelligence of the camel has developed over a very long time indeed, and it is only in the last few moments of the species' existence that things such as trains have begun sharing the otherwise largely empty space that the camel inhabits. And so, despite being masters of their environment up until very recently, they are yet to develop a coping mechanism for being hit by a train. Most of the camel turned to a fine red mist, some smaller pieces were thrown quite a distance, and would later provide a happy mystery to several species of carrion. Most camels ambled out of the way in time, but not all. Those that were looking toward the far horizon or sleeping across the sleek rails were sometimes struck. So while not a common occurrence, the driver of this particular train had been crossing these rails for longer than most, and so had hit enough camels to make this impact more of a surprise to the camel than to him. The driver flicked a switch by his right hand that started up the large silver blades across the windscreen, making short work of the gore and bone fragments. The powerful wiper motors soon cleared the large curve of camel-proof glass. The driver turned his head slightly and spat into a rusted can before flicking the switch again, stilling the now dripping blades. The can had once held tomatoes, though there was no one left who could say with any certainty what a tomato looked like. Once the plants went, the dwindling stock of the canned version provided the only evidence until that too was gone. The driver pushed his train on along the gleaming rails that curved imperceptibly towards the continuum of blue and yellow that was the horizon. This hadn't always been desert. If you dug down far enough beneath those rails, you would eventually find the remains of a once great city. They called it Norwich in its time, but much like the tomatoes, there was nobody left to give it that name or to know that the bones of the city lay beneath the sand. So that is, very different from the stuff that I have been writing and will likely ever write again. But it was a fun exercise. So I hope this has been interesting. I hope it's given you an insight into my writing so far. In the next episodes, I'm going to cover the 3 pieces that I'm writing for my dissertation. So the dissertation is 12,000 words of your choosing. You put a proposal in. My proposal did not survive contact, basically, once I started it. It's now made up of 3 pieces that are essentially life writing, but with, or perhaps autofiction, so with fictive elements woven into episodes from my life and reflections on those things. The one I'm going to talk about in the next episode is a piece which is examining my memories of the death of Princess Diana, the kind of cultural impact that had, alongside the impact it had on just my mother, who was of a similar age and had not a connection to the princess, but I feel like maybe every woman of a similar age at that time maybe felt an affinity with her and were impacted by the tragedy of her death. A little bit of snobbishness around the reaction of the public and the tabloids to her death. So that all went into the mix, but it's a response to losing my own mother, albeit much later on, and that is mixed in with a 100-foot inflatable skeleton that haunts London and becomes a site of pilgrimage for desperately bereaved people. And then I go to visit it, so look forward to that. And then the other 2 pieces, one of them recounts our time living on a farm high up in the moors and basically failing at living on a farm. It's more about how strange it is to have a history that you don't remember. So I was very young at the time, and I don't have memories of the farm except what I've been told secondhand by other people who were there. So it's this kind of belonging to a history that you can't remember, and the unreliability of that. Lots of animal death and gore, and it was always winter, and we shared that farm with another family, and we all moved apart. We moved, and I don't know why, and so this kind of gap in, again, the gap in the personal history and how we fill those, and then that's told in a fairly sort of lyrical style, I guess. That's what I'm aiming for. And there was a giant unkillable turkey who in the story is sort of godlike figure up on the moor. And the third piece is it started out, and I think it maybe will still be, an A to Z of why we are the way we are is the kind of working title. And it's basically an account of mine and my sister's relationship growing up as pretty feral kids and being quite violent towards each other and having this kind of dysfunctional yet functional wild relationship, and then growing up to be like pretty sensible adults, and how we have to kind of leave that ferality behind, if that's a word, which culminates in a very interesting episode with my sister, which I'll talk about more in that episode. So hopefully that's of interest. I'll also try and do an episode of some of the books that I've been reading during the course and during the dissertation that I've just enjoyed, actually. I mean, yeah, useful, but actually also just really enjoyed. That's all for now. Good luck with all your future endeavours. Godspeed. And yeah, speak to you next week. Thank you. Bye, 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 bye.